Now,
And
when I
it's
do
the
that,
exchange of title going from the borrower to me as the lender.
so I'm going to take the property back because I have a secured note. When I do that, what happens there is each state is ran differently, right? Texas, you can do it very quickly, less than 90 days. Where in New Jersey and Ohio, you're looking at over a year. So my pricing also has a timeline on it. I can return my capital in 90 days or 18 months.
Yeah.
So I'm going to price it with that risk level of saying, what do I get annually? In Texas, I may be able to do it 4 times in a year. So I can buy that at a much higher discount, knowing the fact my money will come back quicker, right? If it's not performing. Now, Jersey, I have to 18 months. I have to discount even more because it may take me 18 months plus all the property taxes included. So one of the key factors, if you can originate notes more in like the non-judicial states, like Texas, like Missouri, like Georgia, like all these states, it's key. Now, facet is also, we have debt licenses as note buyers. Certain states require debt licenses for note buyers outside of having a servicer. So states like Illinois is a state we typically stay away from because it requires a debt license and annual cost to it and assurance bond and whatnot. So some states are worth it, some states aren't. So if you're able to create paper in states that we don't need a license, it's more attractive.
Right.
So what other facets, Nathan, do you think that these people who are creating notes should come into play where it would make their paper more valuable?
The biggest one is that interest rate. And as much as we talk about, charging a higher interest rate. So in the creation of that paper where you say, okay, I'm going to sell you this property for, 150,000, 200,000, whatever the number is, where I found the most success in making it the most attractive is high interest rate. And then you can offset that to the borrower. They say, well, holy smokes, 9-10% interest rate. That's really high. And you say, okay, yeah. And we're going to stretch it out over 30 years to help keep your payment low. If they are able to do a higher payment, that's even better. And then you can shorten up that amortization to 20 or 15 years or whatever the case might be. Yeah. But this is where that note math comes into play. And you got to know how the different big five affect each other.
Yes.
So that you can mess around with it, making it a really nice.
We just talked about this in our last week of a 5-week course, and actually 10-week, but we're in the 3rd week of our 5-week. We talk about note math. And if you don't know the note math, you're buying a note. And the math that goes into this is key from origination to buying it. So
on the creating side, that you got to be, so here's the other challenge, right?
Yeah.
You have to be able to do some kind of calculation. This is what we teach in the Creative Dealmaker Academy, is that once you go to closing with that borrower and they sign it, it's game over. Okay. It's done. If you agree to a 4% mortgage and you sign it, you got 4%. If you forgot to put servicing into the deal, you can't add it later. If you didn't escrow taxes and insurance, guess what? Too bad.
So let's clarify why interest rates is such a key. It's your return a year. Plain and simple, right? If I put my money in a money market right now at 3%, I'm making 3% a year. If I put my note in money in a 4% note, I subtract my servicing fee if it's not included in the note, or I'm going to get 4% of my money. Now, if I'm using OPM, do you think I can borrow money at 2% right now and get a 4%? No, right? If I'm using my own money or anywhere else, I can put money to work right now at 10% passively. So I'm not going to take the risk level. So I'm going to have a discount to maybe 12, 15%. So if you write a 4% return a year and I'm going to bid it at say 15, you have to understand the note math changes. The interest rate goes from a 4 to a 15, and watch what happens to the PV, your balance of loan. That's my purchase price. Yeah, that's how it drives it down.
It's massive.
Yes. And you can change whatever you signed on closing day. You can change that later, but it's probably going to be a pretty tough sell. If you've got your
you can surely change it if you can get
the you can go and try to modify, but you're going to say, okay, so just kidding, you're not going to pay 4% anymore. Now you're going to pay 8%. That's going to be a really tough sell.
So what we teach and what we try to show inside Creative Deal Maker is that, let's just say, instead of writing one note,
Mhm.
we break it down and write two. Okay. Instead of
Yes.
writing,
So
instead of
let's
getting
get into
10
that in a second. When someone mentioned a comment about creating notes, I want to ask you before we get to 80-20 rule, people write this thing idea of putting 10% down. So how does 10% down affect a note buyer? Right? It's a warm, fuzzy feeling, but it doesn't go into my math at all.
Mhm.
Right? Because if it's underwritten correctly, I know the borrower can do what it does. Max approved it. He says, listen, the borrower can pay it. I'm not so concerned. Now, do I look at it? I will look at it if they put $1 down or $1,000 down, 300,000. I'm gonna say, whoa, what happened here, right? But it doesn't mean as much. So the down payment really doesn't apply to me too much because the note math doesn't include that. So I see Drew put that he's writing a 9.5% note with 10% down and 30% AM. I'm gonna tell you now that 9.5% note is too cheap.
Yes.
Right, Max, I know you're in the background. What's the kind of average from Call the Underwriter? He underwrites loans throughout the country. What is the average rate notes are being created at now that you've seen?
Bet. Yeah, you bet. Well, you'll probably be unhappy to hear this, but they haven't in the last 2 years, they haven't escalated at the rate of inflation.
It's
When
low.
when the APOR was 2.89 couple of years ago, we still had good note creators putting 9.5% and 10% interest on their notes. So the spread obviously was very good. I was writing probably 8 out of 10 of the notes we were creating were HCMs, high cost mortgage loans, meaning the definition being that is a rate that is 6.5% above the APOR or the street rate of the day. Probably 8 out of 10 files were. Now, 1 in 20 files are an HCM loan, because in order to keep that same spread, when the APOR now is 6.5, you'd need to be in excess north of 12.5% on every one.
So Max,
So
when
there is no arguing that notes are not getting as good of a spread now as they were 2 years ago, period. There's no getting around that.
yeah. So Max, you talk about APR, and that's just the prime offer rate. It's like LIBOR, right? It's an index. But so
street
my
rate.
question to you is this: how do the state usury laws impact the
So
ability to write these mortgages?
clarify what usury is for those people who may not know what
Yeah,
usury
Max.
is.
Yeah, you bet. Okay, so usury is a state limitation on the amount of interest that can be charged on certain loans. It's not the same in every state. The Dodd-Frank side that we help maintain compliance on, a lot of people are always surprised to hear this, but federally, there is no max interest rate. So federally, if your borrower can meet the 8 elements of ability to repay, meaning state-specific residual income, debt-to-income ratio, credit worthiness, 2-year work history, 2-year income history, all of that, all else being equal, your borrower can meet the ability to repay. The feds don't care if it's a 30% interest rate. All they care about is that PITI still fits within this borrower's realm of comfortability with respect to gross monthly income. But then you enter the state-specific arena, and that's where the interest rate matters. And so I always try to tell people, when you're originating, you individually need to sit down with your team in your state. I'm not an expert in all 50 states. I'm the first to admit that. So the investor, that originator, needs to understand in the state that they're originating, are there any limiting factors to the interest rate, and then let that guide where they go from there. And unfortunately, there is a state or two that they're set so low that it doesn't really make it. Right now, when the APOR was 2, then they could still write them at 8, and that was great. But there's a state or two out there right now that I can't imagine anybody wanting to write paper in, because you can't even hardly compete with a bank.
So would you say 9.5 is average, just below average? Where should
Not-
people be kind of aiming at right now?
Yeah, right now 9.5 to probably 11 is very average on stick built. Now I do a lot of mobile home work. I'm doing mobile homes up into 15.
Wow.
So Mobile homes is a whole different matter though, and a lot of people don't want to touch them. So mobile homes tend to run a lot higher, but yeah, stick built home, real common now to see, you know, probably 10 and a quarter is probably pretty average right now. So,
Understand you
but
don't
that
want
tells you that spread is a lot narrower now, right? You got
of course,
an APR almost 7 and an average note now is 10. That
100%.
doesn't look as good as a year and a half ago when the average note was 9 and the APR was a little bit over 3 or a little bit under 3.
And
Yeah.
a lot of times people want to guide to their borrower and say, listen, I'm going to help the borrower out. Granted, you have to by law, and I think you should make sure they can pay, but you also understand the fact that if you want to refi out or if you want to sell it off, right? If you write a note at 11, 12, the borrower can refi next year. They can get you out, which is great. You get paid off earlier. But if you're down at the 8s and 9s, get as high as you can without screwing the borrower over, because if you're looking to cash out, you need to do that, right?
And without going over the
I'll tell
state
you-
usury.
I'll tell you
Yes.
what we do a lot of times, and just so anybody out there listening knows, if they bring something to me and want help with that, I do all the time a situation where we just basically back into the payment. And so a note creator will come to me and say, you know, what's the max that this person can afford? So I've structured a very general deal, but we haven't settled on an interest rate yet. And so I'll calculate all of their gross monthly income up and essentially say, you know, this person, if they'll go for it, you can squeak them in at X amount of interest rate and still keep them under DTI and keep them within residual income. Anything more than that, then they'd have to bring more money down or lower loan amount or whatever. And so I kind of help them figure out what the max is that they can get.
Correct. And one of the terms
borrower
is,
still meets.
but also the term is a big thing for us too, right? Understand the fact that if the term is
How long?
lower,
Yeah.
our discount is not going to be as much because the change of term, right? If you're working a 30-year versus a 10, my discount won't be as much. You can do the math and a financial calculation, but my discount won't be as much because it doesn't take much to change that yield number on a 10-year versus a 30-year, right? Now,
Right.
back to what Nick talked about, the 80-20 thing. Those are creating notes. I encourage you guys to submit loans to us. We'll price them out for you. We have pretty much automation systems to do a lot of the stuff. But 80-20 loans, I think, are the way, if you're creating notes, to do it as best you can. I don't like the whole idea of land contracts, because technically then you create an 80-20 land trust. Who owns the property if you sell one of the land contracts? It doesn't work.